All right, today we're going to work on simplifying fractions. This lesson will be covered throughout the next 3 days, but today we're going to just focus in on how we simplify a fraction. The standard that we're working on is representing rational numbers as fractions, decimals, and mixed numbers. So again, like I said, today we're just going to focus on the fraction piece of it. So the first thing we need to do is we need to understand what is a rational number, and then also what numbers are relatively prime. So a couple things I want you to notice here is a rational number is when you have any number that can be written as a fraction. So any possible number that can be written as a fraction is going to be considered a rational number. So on your note sheet, let's go ahead and write in any number that can be written as a fraction. Now you're probably thinking, well, what types of numbers can't be written as a fraction? Well, if you think of the number pi, pi can't be written as a fraction. It can be written as a symbol, but to write it as a fraction, it's not possible because the decimal goes on forever and ever and ever with no pattern, no repetition there. Okay, so an example of something that could be written as a rational number would be the number 2, because 2 can be written as a fraction as 2 over 1. Okay, another example would be the decimal 1 8/10. I could rewrite this as 1 8 over 10. Okay, our next vocabulary word that we're going to take a look at is numbers that are relatively prime. A relatively prime number is when you have a fraction written in lowest terms. So a fraction written in lowest terms. So that fraction is completely simplified. You cannot simplify it any further. So the fraction 1/2. All right, 1/2 is simplified all the way down. If I were to take a look at the fraction 4/10, this is not relatively prime because I can simplify it. I can divide both 4 and 10 by the same number. I can divide them both by 2, which gives me 2/5. So now the example 2/5 is relatively prime, but the fraction 4/10 is not. So 4/10 does not work as being relatively prime, but 2/5 does. Our next step is how do we simplify a fraction? So if I have the fraction 16/80, I'm going to come back to my divisibility rules that we worked on yesterday. I'm going to think about the number 16 and the number 80. What can I divide both of those numbers by? Well, you might say right off the bat that you can divide them both by 2. So if you can divide them both by 2, go ahead and do that. If you look at them even closer, you might say, well, I can divide both of these numbers by 4. 16 divided by 4 is 4. 80 divided by 4 is 20. So if you find any number that they can both be divided by, go ahead and divide them by. All right, so if we start off by dividing both of these numbers by 4, that's going to leave me with 4/20. But then I have to ask myself again, can I divide both of these numbers by the same thing? Well, yes, I can. I can divide them both by 2, which takes this down to 2/10. And both of those numbers are still even, so I can divide those both by 2 again, and I get 1/5. So you're going to continue to divide or look for divisibility rules until you can't do that any further. Some of you may have noticed right away that both of these numbers can be divided by 16. All right. I'm looking at 80. I'm not sure if I know that 80 is a multiple of 16, so I don't know that I would have started there. Some of you may, though. The highest number that I probably would have gone with is, all right, both of those are divisible by 8 because 16 divided by 8 is 2 and 80 divided by 8 is 10. That would have gotten me to 2/10, which I then can divide both by 2. All right, so divide both of the numerator and the denominator by, in this case, we could say 16, and 16 divided by 16 is 1, 80 divided by 16 is 5. This next one, 20 and 80, 20 80ths, they both end in a 0, so that tells me I can divide them both by 10 to start with, and I divide 20 by 10, I get 2, and 80 divided by 10 gives me 8. 2 and 8, can I divide both of those numbers by the same thing? If you can, then divide them. So in this case, I can divide both of those by 2, which gives me 1, and 8 divided by 2 gives me 4. So in this case, I could divide both numerator and denominator by 10, and then we're going to go ahead and type this in. Do it by 10, and then by 2. Okay, so if I were to do that, I would start off by 20 divided by 10 here, just like I did above, and that gave me 2. 80 divided by 10, and that gave me 8, and then divide both of those by 2, and I get 1 and 4. (15/40). So I'm thinking about my divisibility rules. What are both of these divisible by? Well, one ends in a 5, one ends in a 0, so that tells me that they're both divisible by 5. Divide both the numerator and the denominator, numerator being the top number, denominator being the bottom. Divide the top number by 5, you get 3. Divide the bottom number by 5, you get 8. The key is whatever you divide the top by, you also have to divide the bottom by the same thing. So you can't divide the top by 5, but the bottom by 8. You have to be consistent. Divide them both by the same thing. 3 and 8, that is in lowest terms, so my final answer here is 3/8. What about 8/15? 8 and 15. Well, if I think about what numbers can I divide 8 by, 8 can be divided by 2. It can be divided by 4. Or it can be divided by 8. And then I look at the number 15. 15 could be divided by 3 or 5. There is not a common number in both lists, so that tells me that I can't divide both of those numbers by the same thing. So that tells me that this is already in lowest terms, which means that because it's in lowest terms, then I know it is already relatively prime, which means I can't do anything to it. So what I want you to do now is I want you to flip it over to the back side. After we do these examples, let's do these examples first, and then you're going to flip it over to the back side and do your homework. So looking at 12/18, both of those numbers can be divided by 3. So 12 divided by 3 gives me 4. 18 divided by 3 gives me 6. But then I ask myself again, can I divide both of those by the same thing? And I can divide them both by 2. So 4 divided by 2 is 2. 6 divided by 2 is 3. I can't divide any further. So my relatively prime fraction, my answer is 2/3. 14/28. When I look at this, I notice right away that 14 is half of 28. So I can divide this one by 14, which gives me 7. I'm sorry, which gives me 1. And 28 divided by 14 gives me 2. So my final answer is 1/2. It is now relatively prime. So what I want you to do is I want you to turn it over to the back side, work through the problems on the back, ask me if you have questions, but then this side is your homework for tonight. Thank you for watching.